This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation. Gabriel Gbadamosi talks to Anjali Joseph about her writing life, focusing on her fourth novel, Keeping in Touch.
Anjali Joseph, what an exceptional novelist you are. I haven't quite read anyone like you before. I find myself, for example, reading the two novels of yours, Keeping in Touch and Saraswati Park, that I've read very slowly and wondering, well, what am I doing? It's not a page turner. It doesn't dash, plot driven, beginning, middle and end. What seems to be happening to me is I love to spend time in the rooms with these people. In your novel, Keeping in Touch, one of the main characters, Kateki, she says that she doesn't believe in the future. Why do you think your novels occupy this kind of glorious, unusual space of lingering in that moment, in any given moment that it's in?
Well, I really find in my subjectivity that everything that's happening is a sort of journey away from the present moment and then a return to the present moment. And so one of the things I'm most interested in fiction is to kind of convey this experience of what it is to be human at this point in time and how one negotiates that. And I feel that the kind of novel that I really respond to has this undertone of, at times, melancholy or maybe humor also, but that really what it's about in a way is the experience of being a person in the world and sort of leaving yourself briefly to think about the future or the past or something else and then returning. That kind of movement, those little journeys, is really what interests me in fiction, and that really one of the things I aspire to do in fiction is to bring a reader home to themselves. So in Saraswati Park, there's Mohan, who has this job as a letter writer, and he lives in Bombay, and he takes a local train like people in Bombay do. And he there's a sort of sense, it's one of the things that I was inspired by, is the kind of image of people in Bombay at rush hour crossing the, there's a Maidan between the two main commuter train stations, a park of sorts. I mean, it's like
a public space.
A public space, Maidan, between the two main commuter stations, and it's called the Cross Maidan because that's where you cross over between the two. And in the morning or in the evening, you see this kind of tide of people sort of crossing. And you do kind of wonder, what are these lives? Like, what are these interior lives? Because even in a great city, there are so many sort of untold stories and so many points in life when the shape of a story seems to have left. Once you've crossed certain milestones, like, for example, had some education or started work or maybe been married or had a child or something. What's the next thing? What's the sort of next plot point, as it were? And I think that's one of the great kind of subjective questions is sort of instead of reading literature that feels escapist and has this sense of tension, the kind of novel that I describe to myself as sort of and then instead of that escaping into that, which might have its pleasures, but what is the shape of the kind of novel that will actually make sense of the life that one is living?
Do you feel that there's some sort of conflict between the form that you've chosen, the novel? Are you not trying to do something different with the novel?
I don't know if it's something that's never been done, but I mean, first, I'm so glad you asked that question. Firstly, I think that recently I had a bad review in an Indian newspaper called The Hindu, and the reviewer, who was an assistant professor of literature at one of the Indian Institutes of Technology, this one in Assam, seemed quite annoyed by Keeping in Touch and concluded by saying some things that I found a little obscure in their expression, but she said, I think if I'm paraphrasing, the writing is sort of okay, but you can't write a novel like this. This is not how a novel is written. And I thought, I'm so glad that I'm writing novels and not making rules about how people should write novels. I mean, as we know, especially in English, the name of the novel itself says, make it new, day by day, like the Ezra Pound claims the King of China had inscribed in his bathtub. So if you say it's a novel, it's a novel. One of my inspirations, certainly for Saraswati Park, was Madame Bovary, which I've written about recently in an essay.
The Flaubert novel.
The Flaubert novel. So in that, although there is a great deal of tumult, and there are 3, I think, extramarital affairs that this provincial doctor's wife has, and there's all sorts of things going on, at the same time, actually what strikes me when I read and reread the novel, which I have many times, is these sort of what in French you'd call aleatory moments, these kind of ancillary moments. So, for example, in one of the scenes where there's the two of the characters, Emma, the main character, and one of her boyfriends are making out in a field, the action sort of pulls away from them and it goes on to something like grass waving in the wind. And just this sense of, often in this novel, there's a sense of the natural world bearing witness to these characters, and even kind of phenomenal beauty in the world bearing witness in a way to human beings. So in Keeping in Touch, for example, where, it's in a way an on-off love story, but both of these characters take a long time to settle even into themselves and whatever it is that they want. There's all this conflict, internal conflict. Am I going to revert to past patterns? Am I going to keep being afraid of the things I've always been afraid of? And those are sort of unheroic questions. It's not kind of, I don't know, a wounded soldier carrying a little boy over a mountain pass against the odds and fighting off the Russians in tanks or something. I'm literally making this up. It's not that kind of big drama, but I find it's the actual kinds of drama that one does live. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the kind of drama of the past grabbing at your ankles and, finding a way eventually over time to sort of step out of that clutch.
One of the things that really draws me to your books is that I find myself wanting to linger in those houses, in those rooms, in those railway station platforms with the characters, because I am in India.
Right.
I am allowed to be with Indian people. Here in your novels, I can find myself in Assam.
Right.
And one quality that seems to run throughout your work is the sense of insiderness and outsiderness. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to us a little bit about that? Is it the outsiderness of the writer, or are you a writer because you have this sense of outsiderness?
I don't know, but I do know many other writers who have it. I remember particularly that when I did this creative writing masters, all the students in my year, once we'd met, we all went out for a drink maybe after 2 or 3 days. And I remember noticing that it's the first, I suddenly had this kind of odd realization that instead of the normal social occasion where I was sort of talking to people, but also in some way inside myself watching, actually I was around a table with everyone who was doing the same thing. Everyone was sort of talking and participating, but sitting back and watching.
You met your tribe.
Bit. Yeah, exactly. So I do think it is a kind of writerly quality. And I don't know if that's kind of completely compatible with a great sense of belonging. But one of the Indian writers I love, R.K. Narayan, who was from Mysore and who wrote about a small town in South India that he invented throughout his career. For him, belonging is a huge part of his work. So I don't think that it has to be a sort of spatial non-belonging. It might be something more existential or subtle, I guess.
Let's look at some external details. As far as I know, you're born and initially brought up in India. Mm-hmm. On your mother's side, a Hindu family, and on your father's side, Syrian Christian.
Right.
But then I find you as a schoolgirl in England.
Right.
And then studying English at Trinity College in Cambridge, and then teaching at the Sorbonne, and then doing a creative writing PhD in East Anglia, and then a journalist in India again. Keeping in Touch is something like a love story between an English guy, Indian origin, and an Indian girl, chasing each other, sort of lovelorn, flitting like sort of lovers in a wood across continents. How has, as it were, the impact of all of these different cultural engagements kind of begun to kind of show up in your work, do you feel? Well,
it's difficult for me to know in a concrete sense because I don't have another self who sort of grew up in one place and had a continuous life. But I used to have a great nostalgia for the idea of being somebody who had grown up in one place and had a kind of continuous life there. But that isn't the life that I've had, as you said. I was born in Bombay, and then when I was 7, my family moved to England because my father started teaching at Warwick University, and my parents were there until I was about 20 when I was in college, and then they moved back, and then I've had various periods of living and working in India, and also living and working in Britain, and a year in France. So there was a kind of process of finding my own sense of home as an adult, I think. And I think some of that is a more and more common experience that isn't just about moving between places, but also the fact that kind of traditional contexts have changed so much. I mean, to use a very sort of banal example, in his entire working life, which ended in his 70s, my father had 3 jobs. And if he'd wanted, he could have stayed in just the first one. But by the time I was 30, I couldn't even tell you how many jobs I'd had. So something like that is kind of true for many people I know. So the world isn't necessarily doesn't have the kind of consistency that it used to appear to. It's a great debate in India about whether to sort of trivialize it slightly, whether Indian writers in English shouldn't stop being so annoying and kind of hogging all the money and limelight and let the real Indian writers who write in the various Indian languages kind of have some more space. And there are so many interesting facts around that. Like, one of the things I really enjoyed living in Assam is that it's such a literary culture, and that's something in a small way I participated in by learning Assamese and reading a little bit and having 2 really lovely teachers who helped me. So there are kind of amazing literary cultures in Indian languages. But, I grew up as a child of a South Indian and a South Indian father and a mother who, in fact, is half Gujarati and half Bengali, but from Bombay, who grew up speaking Gujarati and then went to an English medium university. So, and my parents, when my brother and I were young, tried to compromise by speaking Hindi at home, which was a shared Indian language, but probably both of their sort of third languages. And that lasted until my dad had a sabbatical year in Pittsburgh. And then they just reverted to speaking in English, which is what they, would have done anyway. And we spoke English. And so that was sort of the end of that. I don't have an Indian language at that level that I would write in it. And I don't even know which one I would consider a mother tongue. Like, it ought to be perhaps maybe Malayalam. My mother never spoke Bengali, which was her father's language. But she speaks, fluent, obviously, Gujarati and Marathi, and her Hindi is good. I don't really know. And I think I sort of, as ever, compromised by kind of saying, if I'm not sure which side of the room I belong in, I'm going to leave the room and go to another room. So for me, in a way, Assam was a kind of elective situation. And earlier, when we were eating lunch, you said that when you were in Egypt, people mistook you for Egyptian. Well, when I went to Assam, which is a place that I don't have any familial or historic links with, quite a lot of people took me for Assamese. And so I thought, well, okay then. Maybe, yeah. And it's a place that I really loved.
Well, look, there are our sort of multilingual parents, and here are the monolingual offspring. But
I speak French.
You speak French. You struck out. You speak French,
and I speak some Assamese. Yeah,
exactly. So in a way, you've broken your kind of dependence on the language and on the culture by adopting this other one.
Mm-hmm.
Has learning French at all influenced your work? I mean, are you reading all those French novelists, Flaubert?
Yeah. So for sure, I love reading in French, and I still do it sometimes. I mean, I don't read as much in French as I do in English. Mm-hmm. The last novel I read in French was actually great. It's called Yoga, and it's by the writer Emmanuel Carrère. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's translated yet, but it's very funny, and I had a lot to sort of resonate with. The novel is a kind of examination of his different attempts to find some sort of practice that would bring him equilibrium, and also how every time he thinks that he's sort of cracked some kind of serenity, of course his entire life completely falls apart for other reasons. But yeah, all stuff I can really resonate with, for sure.
So here are these kind of various potential influences on your writing. Let's look briefly at reception. I noticed Saraswati Park, which has won prizes on both sides of that old Anglo-Indian divide. In India, people took it, as I understand, as an extraordinary kind of remapping of life in Bombay. What do you think of the way that people read you in Britain?
Actually, I think historically I probably always had better reviews in Britain than in India, but I've certainly had some readers and some, for Saraswati Park, some, I guess, award juries or whatever that liked it. But what are differences? It's so difficult to map because there are so many different things at play, I think. R.K. Narayan, in one of his essays, he talks about how his uncle said to him, he says, you write about things like this character wakes up and then he talks to his mother and then he goes to the river for a bath. And what is this laundry list? I can also write this. And you kind of think, yeah, but probably not though, like not in the same way.
Not with quite the right kind of brand of soap flakes.
So I think that sort of everydayness of Indian life kind of irritated quite a few reviewers to begin with, because they felt that, what's special about this? This is like my life, with irritation. And that's part of my project, to say maybe your life also is, in fact, beautiful.
In Keeping in Touch, there's a really interesting moment in a chapter called Old Masters, in which, after a drunken sort of reunion of former students, one of the characters, Ved, and somebody who we briefly meet in the novel, but is in another novel of yours, decide, slightly hungover, to go into the Fitzwilliam Museum.
Right.
And there's a particular painting that they look at. It's called The Story of Cupid and Psyche,
right.
Part 1.
Part 1, yeah.
And are there any other kind of structural influences on the way you go about constructing a novel?
Well, especially in this novel, which I was completing a draft of probably in the first couple, I've lost track of how many lockdowns there have been, but in 2020 or so, I think I was finishing it. And it's also the time when I began to paint again, which is something I'd loved to do as a child. And I hadn't really done it in between being about 16 or 17 and 2 years ago, so for quite some time. But in any case, I really love going to art galleries, looking at paintings and sort of thinking about paintings. I'm extremely visual in the way that I compose, I think. So, I think that this question of the visual and the image and the images that we sort of store in ourselves and to which we refer when we think of certain things or when we experience certain emotions, I think that was really an important thing in the novel. And the idea very much of simultaneity, of, in a way, everything potentially happening at the same time, which is a kind of classical Hindu idea of time. It's, time as a sort of circle or a disc rather than time as a kind of line. I think that is sort of fascinating because I don't know how much Ketaki says she doesn't quite believe in the future, although she's partly saying that to make, at one point in the novel, to make Ved, calm down and stop creating a future for them. But I'm not sure sometimes how much I believe in the past, which is, something I've written about in one of the Writer's Mosaic essays, in the sense that I think there are many pasts, and every time we revisit one of them, we sort of remake it. So I think that this kind of chaotic sort of another painting that I mentioned in that chapter when Ved and Leela go to the Fitzwilliam is maybe I don't mention by name, but there are some Bruegels in which all kinds of things are happening at the same time, like skeletons are stuffing each other into wells.
Everyone's having a bad time.
Everyone, yeah, classic college reunion type of thing. So, so I feel like it's sort of plausible for my lived experience in a way, like there is a kind of the past can be very now, and different pasts belong to different nows, I think.
The quality of some of your sentences have for me a kind of ghostly kind of presence, and I'm going to cite one to you. Disappointment is easier to bear than happiness. Would you speak to us about what that means?
Well, as a side note, I think that I am really interested in the novel as a kind of one of the really older aspirations of the novel. I think Walter Benjamin talks about it in an essay called The Storyteller, where he says that, stories in some way tell us how to live, whereas the novel comes from this space of being inconsolable because it's sort of written by a lone person in a room, speaking to other future lone people in rooms, reading books. There isn't this kind of human connection. But I think the novel has very often aspired to that sort of, how are we going to live? How are we going to do this kind of question? And I still like that. Not that I want to tell people how to live, but I just think the novel is a great space to think about it. But Ketaki in the novel, when she says disappointment is easier to bear than happiness, she's also speaking very much from her own experience as somebody who's outwardly sort of nonchalant and inwardly extremely fearful because of things that she's gone through. So
let me take you to another line. They're in a pub in Suffolk.
Right.
And you get to the pub by sort of rowing a sort of little boat across the river. And there's a line, trees massed over the river and the sky was made of thought and hope. Would you speak to us about that sentence?
It's interesting because, again, that's when Ketaki is getting a lift, as it were, in the skiff across the river to go back to her friend's house when the rest of her sort of party is still in the pub because she's super sleepy. And she has had a couple of tokes on a spliff, but that isn't really the main experience. There is that she's been quite anxious and sleep deprived, and now she's incredibly sleepy and about to sort of entering a huge what's going to be a huge sleep, I think. So the disorientation there and the sense of these different time periods kind of smudging together is something that I've certainly experienced. When you're just very, very tired, there's a kind of amazing, surreal, almost trip-like quality to being extremely tired, I find.
Yes.
And so I think that's sort of what's happening there, that it's a kind of, it's a big affective smudge, really, and all of these different experiences in her life all begin to seem equally unreal and sort of equally possible to smear together in a way. She sort of thinks about different things in history and, there's a sort of tarot reference, and I don't know, everything visual and affective and felt and is kind of all smushed up.
When we first meet her as a character at the beginning, as the novel opens, of course I sort of leap to judgment. I think, here's a very kind of attractive kind of young lady, and she's playing the part.
Right.
A little coquettish, perhaps, but actually inside, she doesn't really believe it. She doesn't really feel it. There is an internal emptiness. I should add that towards the end of the novel, I picked out another sentence about this young Ketaki, which was, her face was visible only as gleams of light and areas of obscurity. She's kind of flashing and vanishing all the way through the book, all the way through the novel. And that doesn't seem to change.
Well, that's also from the point, that part is from the point of view of Ved. So Ved is in love with her, and Ved is kind of finds her insaisissable, and that's sort of the allure in a way. And in the moments when she does appear more approachable, it's actually where he loses his grip a bit and he doesn't really know, in fact, how to approach her or what to do with the fact that she is more approachable. So what's a sort of long practiced defense mechanism in a way for her is also something that really pulls him in, because he's not a person who's comfortable enough with himself to be okay with someone who says, yes, I like you too, and I would like to see you every Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday for the rest of our lives. He'd basically be running for the hills or the train station, on the regular if that kind of thing happened.
So it's like a struggle of the sexes going on?
I actually thought of it as something more sort of elemental than that in a way. I think of her as somebody who is really interested in these questions of what's underneath the whole manifest world, and who has two things are allied in her. One is a kind of innate interest in that question and an innate sort of interest in the kind of watcher inside her. And the other one is that she's had a difficult youth, and so she's pretty gun shy about commitment and relationships and things like that. And so this sort of habitual being flaky, if you like, is a kind of way of just not having to deal with things. But we'd also see her from her own point of view, roughly half the time, and that's a somewhat different experience. She kind of has she has some amusement about dealing with Ved and dealing with other people, And there's a sort of there's kind of a lightness and irony that is very much part of Assamese culture also. I mean, that she enjoys a sort of social game in a way of dealing with people, and sees kind of charm and merit in that social game because it always stems from a sort of essential lightness. But I also don't think that Ved is necessarily completely, is it that he's completely masculine, or he has his own kind of wounds and non-belongings, and in some ways he especially when he moves to Assam, I think that's my favorite sort of Ved. I mean, he's like a person who's trying to find the Rosetta Stone of what life in Assam is like.
The language.
Learning the language, trying to figure out the culture, trying to understand. He gets
leaving a good corporate job.
Yeah, he gets a book which is a real book called Assam and the Assamese Mind, and he's sort of trying to figure out what it's all about in some way. But then in a way, because he has this quite mechanistic approach, he's not going to get it, and also because it's an incredibly sophisticated, paradoxical literary sensibility, he's not going to get it, and that sort of frustration, the kind of being Alice in Wonderland, or being maybe Marcel in Search of Lost Time. Like there's always this feeling of not quite apprehending the rules.
Is there something in that kind of positioning for women, that gendered positioning, that looking back you can see working in your novels? Oh,
actually, I see Leela quite differently, and it's sort of I wanted to do this because I was kind of inspired by one of the novelists I really enjoy reading, Upamanyu Chatterjee. He wrote his first novel, English August, has a young civil servant called Agastya Sen, who's very kind of charming and fun and stuck in his first small town posting, smoking weed, reading Marcus Aurelius and masturbating a lot and kind of wishing he was always somewhere else. And then that character reappears in, I think it's maybe his third novel, called Memories of the Welfare State, and he's still a civil servant, but a much more sort of, he's a more cynical version, he's just a less mirthful version too, though he has his moments. And I was sort of interested in this kind of deliberate discontinuity, that it's the same character nominally, but it really doesn't feel like the same person in some ways. And I thought it would be fun to do that. So Leela in Another Country is really doesn't manifest in quite the same way at all as Leela in
Keeping
in Touch, where she basically makes a cameo. But I don't see her as in fact being vague. I see her as being incredibly clear-sighted about Ved in a way that Ketaki isn't, and that Ved also isn't. I mean, there's sort of people who've known each other when they were 18 and 19 and 20, and she doesn't really have any time for his kind of stuff. So even at the end, I mean, they have a sort of not a fling, they have a one-night stand of sorts, a drunken one-night stand. But even when Ved is saying goodbye and sort of making the usual noises about "I'll call you" or something, she just tells him to get stuffed, because I think that there's just a Ved to her is a really prosaic animal, not a sort of potential love interest or whatever.
Just finally on Keeping in Touch, there is a chapter towards the end called The Dark. In that chapter, there's a very, very dark sense of India in the present moment. Could you talk to us about that?
I don't know if it's actually just in that chapter. Maybe it's sort of more present there. But it's certainly something that I felt when I was writing this novel, which I must have started around 2015 and sort of finally finished around 5 years later. And I was living in India for half that time. That there has been a change in sensibility. There's been a sort of ugliness that's emerged, and a kind of open violence and anger as a sort of predominant mood in how people relate to each other. That not that these things were invented, a few years ago, but that they've sort of become so much more of the mode in which people relate to each other, both in terms of the things that happen in the news and the kind of again, governments that kill their own civilians and so on, like kind of countless incidents of some Muslim somewhere in the north of India who's been targeted on the suspicion of eating beef or selling a cow for slaughter or whatever it is, sort of jingoistic crimes that are actually an excuse for just violence.
Yes.
But not just those things, but also in the way that people relate to each other, the amount of patience or ability that everyday people have for listening to other people's views, I felt had really decreased. And that's something I didn't remember from when I was younger, that when I was younger, people had differing views, but it wasn't, they didn't feel ready to, get super angry and shout at other people all the time about it. The level of overall anger, I'm trying not to use the word intolerance because, as the novel, there's one scene in the novel where Vaid and another character discuss the question of tolerance, and I don't think tolerance is really the right word. The whole situation has just become more fraught and more high key, and I don't think that was the case maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever. It's not because everyone agreed with each other and not because atrocities didn't happen, but I don't think everyone was so angry.
The social and sexual mores of your characters are really kind of breathtaking and a breath of fresh air for me. In Saraswati Park, just to take one example, there is an extended engagement with a same-sex relationship, a younger boy and an older man, a university lecturer and an acolyte, a student. It's a great gift that you give to readers reading your novels to see sort of how free and how direct and how realistic these portraits of people's lives are.
Well, in Saraswati Park, I guess there's a young person trying to begin his romantic life. And then there's his uncle and aunt who have, been married for a long time, and their relationship is kind of going through its own questions and sort of absences and problems. But I think that for long relationships, it struck me that there is a line somewhere in the book about how you marry somebody and then you both go on changing almost randomly, it seems, until you have these different configurations, as though if two people are married for 40 years, it may be the case that actually each of them has been about 40 people and has been married to another 40 people, in sort of random permutations. I'm not much of a mathematician, but I think that would be a lot of permutations. I think that's kind of what I feel about longer relationships, that there is this, the apparent continuity is beautiful, but there's also a lot of lived discontinuity. And that's not really merely in relationships. That could be with everything, living in a country, doing a profession, whatever, just being a person. The sort of fact of going around in one, what do they call it, skin suit the whole time sort of suggests that there's more of an internal continuity of experience than in some ways there is. So I think this sort of focus on the moment in a way is kind of trying to foreground that. But I think there's some kind of duality that's always happening where, it's not on the one hand Descartes claiming that because thought is happening, there's a sort of continuous self. I don't that doesn't completely resonate. But it's also not completely, David Hume points out post-Descartes that there's no real need to extrapolate a continuous self between all of these experiences, that each experience could be like a kind of, like you say, like a individual mote, like something that lives and flares and dies. And just because there seems to be a subjectivity, an I in each experience, that doesn't mean it's the same one. It could be tons and tons of very short films, if you like, with no common author.
Anjali Joseph, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For a lovely talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gabriel Gbadamosi was talking to Anjali Joseph. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.